So welcome everyone to Postman Expert. Now, before I get into the course itself, there are a couple of points, some highlights. So course material is on that URL. It's another GitHub repository. And what you'll find there is, where did that go? What you'll find there is a text file, like what we had before. And on that text file, there'll be some instructions on what you need to do to import the relevant collections and environments. So we're starting off with some pre-created collections and environments for you guys. And you also find the copy and paste text that we have throughout the exercises as well. And of course, there will be a copy of the slides in the PDF file. There's also a JSON file of the collection and environment. That's more or less just there for backup. We don't really need that unless the import doesn't work, unless the actual run in Postman doesn't work for you. So you'll find this link to exercise 1.1 using environments. Just click on Run in Postman and import this into your Postman workspace. So you should have exercise 1.1 to begin with. So make sure you can access those course materials. But let's begin on Postman Expert. So for those of you who attended this morning's fundamental session, we're more or less continuing on with the features of the product. And what we're going to do here is start looking at how Postman supports the API lifecycle, the various stages of the API lifecycle. If you weren't here this morning, my name's Johnny, and I run training for on a number of different software platforms. I helped build the Postman Fundamentals and Expert course, and have been delivering that for around a year. And prior to that, I was building content for Docker and for Nginx. So the session will run for 3 hours. We will take a break roughly every hour, or maybe at the halfway point, depending on how we go for time. And the format is more or less the same as what we had this morning: slides, demonstrations, and exercises. Feel free to ask your questions at any time. There is some prerequisite knowledge, so either you've taken fundamentals before, you were there this morning, or you are reasonably familiar with the following topics, like you know what a Postman request is, how to set up a collection, how to use variables and environments. You know some basic scripting to test your APIs, some simple JavaScript code. You don't need to be a JavaScript expert at all. We primarily work with code snippets. And you have an understanding of the HTTP request structure. So your HTTP methods, common headers. And of course, you need to have your Postman desktop application set up and ready to go. If you don't have that already, please install. But I think everyone's good with that. With the course material, so the first thing we need is to go to that URL. You'll find a copy and paste link on the exercise file, but this is basically the page that we go to. Hit Run in Postman and import a collection and an environment into your workspace. I'd also recommend that you set up a new empty workspace to start with for this particular workshop. So I've called mine Expert Workshop. And you should have this exercise 1.1 using environments collection, and also an environment called test env. So you should have both of those. If you're looking for, oh yep, sure. So this is the URL, and if you just go to this GitHub repository, where is that going? If you just go here to this GitHub repo, there's a text file that you can access. And that text file will have the instructions as well as the links. So you can see there, course material, collection to import, and you can copy and paste that in. So I'll give you guys some time to have that set up. Do you need the repository URL? Yeah. OK, so this is the repository URL. And then from there, you can get the rest of the links. All right, has everyone got their collection imported and the environment? OK, if you need a bit more time, please do let me know. So that's one set of the material. There's one more to go. So there's one additional collection called RESTful Booker, and the way we're going to get that is through a template. So I'll demonstrate this inside Postman. What you want to do is click on the New button at the top, select Templates in the middle, and just do a little search for Postman Workshop. And what you should see is this one here, Postman Workshop RESTful Booker. So you select that, click on Run in Postman, and then click on OK, and that should import a collection called RESTful Booker into your environment. So search for Postman Workshop in the templates, and then you should see this option here. So at the end of all this, on your workspace, what you should see is two collections, Exercise 1.1, using environments, and another one called RESTful Booker, and you should have one environment called Test ENV. So if you haven't got all of those, let me know. For those that have just joined us, you can grab the course materials from this URL. That's a GitHub repository. You'll find an exercise file and a PDF copy of the slides. In the exercise text file, there will be additional instructions for where you can import the necessary collections and environments that we need for our exercises. And if you need more info on that, just put up your hand and one of us can come around to help you out. So that's if you're just joining us now. Otherwise, does everyone else have their collections imported? So what we have on the agenda for this afternoon, we're going to be looking at running a collection, so running all of the requests within the collection. And then in the advanced scripting section, we will look at how we can control the order in which we send those requests. So that's building a workflow. We'll then use our collection to generate some API documentation. We'll also set up some mock servers and monitor our API. We'll monitor our collection. So that's the session for this afternoon. And we'll start on our first module, which is a collection run. So we'll look at how to start a collection run, use environments, and I'll talk a little bit about running multiple iterations and uploading data files as well. So what is a collection run? So a collection run is basically an execution of all of the requests within a collection. Those requests are run sequentially, one after another, in the order in which they are defined in your collection. And there are a couple of ways we can run a collection. You can use the Postman Application Collection Runner, which is what we'll be looking at in this chapter. You can use Neuman, which is a command line version of that, or you can use a Postman monitor, and we'll talk about monitors a little bit later on. Why do we run a collection? Well, to automate our API test. If we have lots of requests, we don't just want to keep hitting send requests on every single one of them manually. That's very slow. So we run the collection instead. We can also then build scripts into these tests so that we can help to mirror a particular workflow or replicate a user experience. For example, if I am testing my shopping cart API, one of the functions that we want to test for is to order a product. But ordering a product involves making potentially tens or maybe even hundreds of API calls. You have to search for the product, you got to add it to your shopping cart, you got to go through the checkout, payment, and everything. All of those would be a separate API call, and so we want to run a collection to run through all the necessary endpoints that we need for that particular user story. You can also test for hundreds of scenarios by using a data file. So starting a collection run, we open the collection runner, we choose the collection we want to run. Now you can run an entire collection, or you can run a specific folder in the collection. Choosing a folder means we only run the requests that are within that folder. And then you hit run, you get your results, you see which requests pass and which ones failed. Failed requests are the ones where you have a test case that did not pass. So you can see that red one in the middle there, that was a failed request. You can drill down into your results and that will allow you to inspect the details of the request and the response. So you can check the request URL, the headers, response body, response headers, and that's useful to help troubleshoot any requests that failed. We can also use variables in a collection run as well. Now, this option here that says keep variable values, that has an effect on what happens to your environment variables. And what we're going to do is start off with a little exercise to demonstrate that effect. So this will show us how to run a collection and what that variable option means. So we have our exercise 1.1 using environments collection. There's only one request in here. It's a Postman echo. And what I want to do is run this, but before I do it, I'm going to open that test env environment. There's two variables in here. One of them is foo. Now, the current value for this, what we want to do is make sure we set it to bar. So if it's set to bar2, just change it back to bar. And I'm going to send the request. Now, I'm not too concerned about what I get in my response here. What I want to look into is once I send the request and I check my environment values, you can see that the foo variable, the current value, has changed back to bar2. Now, the reason that occurs is because if we look at our tests that we have here, at the very end of this script, we have a pm.environment.set foo to bar2. So we are essentially, at the end of this request, setting the foo variable to bar2. That's why it changed back. So that's what happens if I run my requests normally. What happens if I run it as part of a collection? So to use the collection runner, we click on Runner at the top. We choose the collection we want to run, which will be using environments. Choose the environment we want to use, test env. Now, before I run this, let's make sure we change that back to bar, otherwise it won't pass the test. Sorry?
Click runner on the top.
Top navigation, yeah. So now we've selected test env. Now, the first time I run this, I'm going to this keep variable values option here, I'm going to leave that checkbox empty. So I won't tick that. I'll hit run. Our request runs. It passes, as you can see. If you want to drill down, you can click on that, and you can drill down into the request URL, the response body, the headers, etc. But it passes, and if I check my variables again, there's no change. So what happens is, at the end of a collection run, by default, at the end of a collection run, the values of your variables will revert back to whatever they were at the beginning of that collection run. So if your requests within a collection changes the value of those variables, they are not persisted. They just revert back to what they were, unless we tick this option to keep the variable values. If we tick that option, then whatever changes we make to our variables during that collection run, those changes are persisted. So on the second run through, if I check my variables again afterwards, you can see the current value being modified to bar2. That's what that checkbox does. And that is essentially a demonstration of the steps on this exercise here. So try that out. Let me know if you have any questions, and if you joined us a little bit late and you're still getting your collections set up or imported, let us know here and we can help you out. When you run a collection, you can also run multiple iterations. There's a field there called iterations. So that means how many times you want to run the collection. And you might want to run multiple times just to test for consistent behavior. So especially if you're doing things like modifying variables a lot, on a subsequent run, the collection might fail because you've changed something and now the request doesn't match anymore. So when you look at the results for multiple iterations, you'll see that each iteration is displayed on the right-hand side there, and then you see the results for that entire iteration. There's also the red and green filter. That's these two circles at the top. So you can filter your results based on pass or fail. So if you want to only see the failed results, you can use that red filter there. And there's also a run summary. This is useful when you run lots of iterations because you get a table view. So now each iteration is being displayed on the top column. And for each request, you can see in which iteration it passed and failed. And just by looking at this table, if I look at request number 1 there, I can see that it's alternating between pass, fail, pass, fail. And so just by looking at that, I can say, all right, why is it doing that? I'm going to inspect the details of request 1 to figure out what's happening. So that's the run summary button. You see that on your collection runner right at the top. And so this one failed because my test failed. Another thing we can do when we run a collection is upload a data file. So you can upload a data file and use the values in that file as part of your requests and your scripts. There are 2 types of files we support, CSV and JSON. Each record in the data file is treated as a separate iteration. So this is useful because we can now test our APIs more extensively by testing for variations in our request parameters. So if you're running a request and you want to check different possible parameter values, instead of defining a request for each parameter value, you just define the one request and you have a data file which has all those different values in there. You can also use this to do things like database initialization and do your setup and teardown for your test environments. Now, during the fundamentals session this morning, I talked about different scoping levels for our variables: global, collection, environment, local, and data. The values from your CSV and JSON file during a collection run, they are treated as data level variables. So that's the narrowest scope. And the variables are used in the same manner as your global or your collection and your environment variables, except being a data variable, it'll take precedence over those other levels. This is an example of what the CSV file format should look like. So your first row has the variable names that are going to be used in the requests. So you can see there, city, country. These 2 match up to this city and country variable here. Every row after that is treated as a data row, and so each one of these rows would represent one iteration of the collection run. So the first request that we're going to send from that data file is going to be this Open Weather API. We're going to check for the weather of Sydney in Australia, and then the second one will check for London in UK, third one Seattle, etc. So they get substituted into where those variables are defined in your request. This API key here, this variable isn't defined in my data file, so the API key will be taken from wherever we define that value, either in the collection or in the environment. All of your rows in the CSV file should have the same number of columns as well. So that's the CSV format. You can also use the JSON format. So you have an array of key value pairs, each key representing the name of a variable. So city and country, and the values, and each object in that array is a separate iteration when you run the collection. So that's using your data files. Now, during those collection runs, you might find that things don't behave as we expect. And so one way we can debug our requests is by using the Postman console. The console allows us to drill down on the results and also to inspect requests and response headers and the body as well. But to use the console, or for anything to be displayed on the console, you must have the console open before you run the collection. Otherwise, nothing goes there. So to open the console, we click on this console button down on the bottom left. And then we can go and run our collection. I'll go to my runner, choose using environments, and pick my test env, run. So we have a failure here, and if I go to my console, here's the request. Request headers, body, response headers, response body. So this could help me to troubleshoot. But what's more useful here is that I can also log custom lines to that console as well. So if I'm writing my own scripts, I can choose to write some log output onto the console and say, OK, this is where I am in the script, or log the values of various variables in my script, and I can look at that on the console to help me debug. You'll see an example of that later on. So that's running a collection using the collection runner. The other option we have is using Neuman, which is the command line version of that collection runner. So anything that you can do on the collection runner, you can do on Neuman. They maintain feature parity. And Neuman is built on Node.js. So to set it up, you need Node.js, you need NPM. But the advantage of using Neuman is because it runs on the command line, you can easily integrate it into a CI/CD process. So if you need to run collections as part of your application build on a CI/CD server, you can use Neuman for that. And the way it works is you run this command, Neuman run, and then you specify your collection file. So at a simple level, you do have to export your collection and the environment it uses to a JSON file, and then you specify that collection file and the environment on your Neuman command. You can also avoid that by using the Postman API. You can make a Postman API call to get to the collection itself, and therefore you don't have to do that export process. But that's a simple example of running Neuman. And then you can see the results being displayed on the terminal. There are some additional run parameters, so -h to see all the run options, and -e to specify an environment file, -n to specify number of iterations. We won't actually look at using Neuman in the course, but this is just a quick reference. Yep.
Where do we get Neuman?
So to install Neuman, you need to install Node.js, and then there's a process that you go through. So you install Node.js, and then you run the npm package, npm install Neuman, and that'll set it up for you. Normally, we actually do that in the course, but this is usually like a 4 to 4.5 hour session. We're compressing into 3, so I had to take a few things out. All right, so that's a quick review of running collections. So we can run collections using the collection runner on the app, using Neuman. We can changes in variable values during a collection run are not persisted by default. You have to remember to tick that keep variable values option if you want to persist it. And using a data file allows us to run a collection over many iterations to test for as many variations in our input as needed. OK? So let's go into advanced scripting here. So I want to talk more about writing our test scripts, but also in this chapter, we'll explore something called a pre-request script and what we can use that for. And a big focus of this section is going to be to set the script execution order in order to create a workflow. Workflow is a big part of this course. So a quick recap, especially for those of you who did fundamentals this morning, you would have seen this already. So we know we can execute JavaScript code after we receive a response to test that response, basically. And when we write that JavaScript code, we've got access to the request, response, and our variable data. That's what the Sandbox API provides us with. There's a set of variables and functions that allow us to access that data. And we see the results on our test results tab. We see what test cases pass, which ones failed, etc. Now, there are two types of scripts we can write. We saw a little bit of the test scripts in the fundamentals session, but another type of script is called a pre-request script. And this is a script that is executed before we actually send the request. You can see the two tabs there, pre-request and test. So let's have a look at the script execution order. For an individual request, before we actually send a request, we actually run through all of the pre-request scripts that we define. And you can use this to do things like manipulate the data of the variables or set dates and times before you send the request. So we send the request, we get our response, and then we run through all the test scripts that we define on that request. So that's the basic script execution order. But when you are running within a collection, it gets a bit more extensive to that. So you can define pre-request scripts and test scripts at the collection level and also at the folder level within that collection. And if you do that, for every request that you run, the first thing that happens is all of the pre-request scripts at the collection level are executed first. Then the pre-request scripts at the folder level get executed, and then the pre-request script on the actual request itself. So if you've got things that you want to do for every single request in a collection, then you'd put that into the collection level pre-request script. You run the requests, get the response, and then we follow the same pattern with our test scripts. Test scripts at the collection level are executed first, followed by the ones at the folder level, and then the individual test scripts for that request. So again, if there's something you want to test for in every single request, like let's say you want to make sure that no matter what request you're running, you get a HTTP status code of 200 as the response, rather than putting that test in every single request, just put it in the collection and it will run for every request in that collection. So that's the script execution order once we factor in the collection. And when you're writing these scripts, debugging is very useful because sometimes things don't behave as you expect and you're left wondering what my various data values are, etc. So the console.log function is what we can use to log output into that Postman console. So you can log the values of some variables or response data, or you can log some string just to inspect the flow of your script. Like here, we've got an if statement, if else, and sometimes it's not clear which statement is triggered, and so therefore you can log something just to inspect where it actually ends up. And again, remember, your Postman console must be open before you run the requests, otherwise nothing gets outputted there. So let's look at an example of a pre-request script. Let's write a pre-request script. They're very similar to test scripts. They are written in JavaScript, basically the same as test scripts. The only difference is in pre-request scripts, you do not have access to the response object because obviously there is no response. We haven't sent the request yet. A typical use case for pre-request scripts is to manipulate data before we send it, like setting some variable values as part of a function call, or adding some headers, adding like a timestamp header, for example. So we've got an exercise to go through this. We're going to create a new collection called Forex, foreign exchange. So a new collection, call it Forex. And then we'll define a new request and save it to that collection. Now this request, we're going to use this URL here. This is an exchange rate API. And you can see there, we have two variables in this. We have a date and a currency. So basically, I want to see the exchange rates of a specified currency for a specified date. Now, to define the values for those two variables, we are going to set up an environment called Forex, and we'll have the currency and date variables defined. We'll set the currency to USD, but for the date variable, we're going to set a placeholder, and I'll explain why. So let me get there first. So let's create a new environment called Forex, variable of date. Leave this as a placeholder. And then currency. And we'll set that to USD. Now the reason I want the date variable as a placeholder is because let's say I have a particular use case where I always want to get the exchange rate from 7 days ago. So no matter when I am running this request, I always want the exchange rate for 7 days ago, so last week. If I specify that as a date here, like today's the 11th of September, last week would have been the 4th. I could specify the 4th as my date value, but the problem with that is every time I run this request, I have to modify the date and keep modifying it so that it's always 7 days prior. Instead of doing that, why don't I use a script to dynamically calculate that for me? Oops. I didn't save that. Let's do that again. Date, currency. Click add. OK. So why don't I use a pre-request script to dynamically calculate that date for me? And that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to put this pre-request script in there, and then we'll run the requests. And what we should see is the exchange rate for the 4th of September. So that script, again, copy and paste. So this is using the moment library in JavaScript. And basically what we're doing is we are getting a value called previous week. We're getting the current date and time and telling it to subtract 7 days and then formatting it into this format here. 4 digits for year, 2 for month, 2 for day. And then we're going to set the date variable by using pm.environment.setDate to previous week, which is this calculated value. So now with this script, I will always calculate the value of the date based on what's today and subtracting 7 days. And let's send that request by using the 4x environment. And in the response, we can verify that. You can see the date, 4th of September, which is exactly 7 days prior to today. And that's USD as a currency, and we can see all the various exchange rates. So that is exercise 2.1. Have I got that? Oh, and we're meant to save this into the collection as well. So I'll save it, and I'll call it get historical exchange rate. So that was our exercise for the pre-request script. Now with test scripts, a couple of examples of what we can do: checking response codes, checking for JSON values, so making sure that we get the data that we expect, checking response headers and the body, etc. So those are examples of test scripts. But what we want to do now is use that and also use it to build a workflow. So what is a workflow in the context of Postman? A workflow is a sequence of requests in a collection that can represent a particular user story or an application feature. For example, ordering a product if we're dealing with a shopping cart or shopping cart API. Each sequence in that workflow is a separate API call. Like here, this is the sequence. This is a very simplified sequence for purchasing an item from a store. We do a search for our product, and this is the call that we make, product question mark Q equals 2. We add that to the shopping cart. We do the checkout process where we supply all the details. Then we check the credit card, making sure it's valid, so that's calling the payment gateway. And if all of that's successful, then we'll send an order confirmation email. So each one of those requests needs to happen in order to check that particular user story or application feature. And so we need to run those requests in that particular sequence. Now in Postman, when you run a collection, the order in which your requests are run is the order in which they are listed in the collection. So if I look at my RESTful Booker collection here, they will run in exactly this order that I've defined. Get bookings, create new, update, get booking ID, delete, and then get auth token. But when I'm testing a particular user story or feature, that's not necessarily the order I want them to run in. So we need to control the request order. So to do that, we can use this function called postman.setNextRequest, and we use it to set what the next request is going to be in our collection run. And you can indicate that request by specifying the request name. So postman.setNextRequest, followed by the name of the request. Or you set it to null, which means there is no next request, and hence this one that we are running is the very last one. Now, there's a couple of caveats about that Postman setNextRequest function. So you can use it both in your pre-requests and in your test scripts. and you can set it multiple times, but only the last set value is considered. So if you do set next request here, and then you do it again at the end of the script, the last value that you set is the one that is considered by Postman. It's always executed at the end of your current script. And the scope of the function is also limited to the source of your collection run. What that means is, if I'm running the entire collection, then I can set any request as my next request. But if I'm only running a folder in that collection, then I am limited to requests in the same folder. So let's say, in this example here, let's say I'm only running the bookings folder in my RESTful Booker collection here. When I do set next request, I can only set the request in the same bookings folder. I cannot select any request that's in a different folder or any request that is not in any particular folder. So you're limited to that folder as your scope. Now, we have a API that we're going to use for this particular workflow. This API is RESTful Booker, and the one that we're using is basically my version of it, but it's based on the same one that we saw in the fundamentals session by Mark Winteringham. That one's hosted online in the cloud. My one's hosted in my own little environment, and there's a couple of differences there. But basically, it does the same thing. It has the same endpoints. So the requests that we have in our collection are get bookings, to get a list of all our bookings, create new booking, update, get booking by ID, so we specify a specific ID that we want to get a specific booking. Then we delete and get an auth token. Now, this is the order in which this is not the order that we want to run in. This is the order that they're currently listed in. The order that we want is slightly different. So when we build our workflow, we want to start with get bookings. Then we want to create a new booking. So this is going to create a new hotel booking for someone called Sally. And as part of this, it's going to return us the booking ID using this ID field. We want to then save this booking ID value, and in step 3, we want to look up that booking ID. So what I just created, I want to do a search for that booking based on the ID number. So what we're going to observe here is that the output of step 2 is going to, or part of the output of step 2 is going to be used as input for step 3. This is the first half of the workflow. There's a couple of different parts to this, but we'll start with this half. And the way we're going to do that is, first of all, we have our RESTful Booker collection, so we'll open that up, and we'll create an environment called RESTful Booker and define a URL. Now, the value of the URL is an IP address. I have put that into the exercise text file, so you should see that here. That's where it's hosted. So I'm going to define my environment. Copy that. So that's what we'll start with. We also want a variable called booking ID, but we're not going to set a value. We're going to leave that blank or set a placeholder. So go back into the environment, booking ID, and I'll just put a placeholder in here. Click on Update. Now, we'll open the Create New Booking requests, which is inside the RESTful Booker collection. And we're going to go to the Test tab and add these lines in there. So let's go to, let me copy those lines. So exercise 2.2, step number 5, copy these lines. And then I'll open Create New Booking. Let's close that now. I don't need that anymore. So here's my Create New Booking requests. We'll go to the Test tab. There's already a test case written in there, but at the bottom of that, we'll put these additional lines. So what we're doing is we are grabbing the booking ID, saving that into the booking ID variable, and then setting the next request to get booking by ID. On the default order, create new booking is followed by update booking, but we don't want to do that next in our workflow. We want to do get booking by ID. So by setting the next request, I'm telling Postman to jump to the get booking by ID request and run that next. We're also logging the booking ID onto the console as well. So let's save this and let's run it, choosing my RESTful Booker environment. And here's the result. So you can see we've created a new booking. The ID number that we got for this is this string here. And this should be saved into our booking ID environment variable. You can see that, booking ID, current value is now the same as that.
URL value, where did that come
The URL is this IP address here. So that's on the text file. So 167.71.124.251. Yep. So there was a question there regarding a scenario where as soon as we set the current value, it also automatically set the initial. If you're observing that, the reason that occurs is because if you look at your settings, there is an option here that is called automatically persist variable values. So what that means is if that's turned on, whenever you set the current value of a variable, it'll set the initial one as well. And I usually have that turned off. We just want to set the current values. So that's configured in your settings. All right, so the other part to this exercise is once you've run that create new booking request and you've seen it set the booking ID, we can now run get booking by ID manually. You'll see that in this request, we have the URL, and we also have the booking ID at the end. Now, this was automatically set on my previous request, so now when I run this, I should be looking at the result for the booking ID that I got previously. So hit send, and I get that same record returned in the result. If you want, you can play around with the body of the request in create new booking, so you can change the first name, last name, etc. But that is essentially exercise 2.2.